Hey guys, it's Charlene. Today I'm going to be showing you how to make a shaker card using your word and shadow dies. So I'm using the Doggie Dig It stamp set, which is super cute, along with the Love Paw and Shadow die, as well as the Sprinkle Scallops frames in order to create the card. So let's get started. Last week I made this really cute background using the Dotty stencil, so I wanted to use up the rest of it to create today's card. So instead I'm focusing on how to create a shaker. So you can see there I had my word and shadow die, and I used it to cut out of what I want to be my top layer of my card. And now all I'm doing is I'm going around with some liquid adhesive. You also could use double-sided tape, and I'm going all around the word before I add my acetate. So you just use a piece of acetate behind there, so that way you're not going to have any shaker pieces coming out. Once you get your acetate on there, if you're using liquid adhesive, you do want to set it aside and give it just a little bit of dry time. You don't have to do that if you're using the double-sided tape. You can see off in the upper left hand corner there, I also cut out the word and shadow die from white cardstock. Now, depending on your word and shadow die that you're using for this technique, you may or may not need this outer frame piece in order to really make your card stand out. But because the word love on this word and shadow die is quite big, I didn't want to use that. I wanted to use the outline piece, if that makes sense. Hopefully that makes sense. So now I'm just going to dot that with some liquid adhesive all the way around, and I'm going to go ahead and pop it into the front of my card right over the acetate. Now if you are using liquid adhesive, you might get a little bit here and there on your acetate, and I'm going to show you a really easy trick to remove that glue from your acetate. And it's super easy, and it cleans up your cards really quickly. Now I'm going to go ahead and pop that in and adhere it down. This word and shadow die is super cute. If you wanted to, you could also cut out that little paw in another color and maybe pop that in. There's lots of different ways you could do this. Really what you're wanting to look for when you're going to make a shaker card using a word and shadow die is you want the word to be big enough and the outline shadow die to be big enough that you're going to be able to see the shaker bits inside. So this works particularly well with large word and shadow dies. Now you can do a fun version of this card where you have several repeating windows across the front of the card. That's something else I like to do when I'm doing this technique. So now you can see I have used the white cutout that I have of the word love, and I popped it in to the front of the card there, so that way I could take those little tiny inset pieces, add some glue, and just know where they needed to be placed. You certainly don't need to do that. You could just eyeball it. For me, I like to try and get them where the designer intended for them to be on the word. So I usually will put the negative in, so that way I can kind of pop the little piece right where it needs to go. And you just want to have a small tool, some kind of weeding tool or jewel picker or something, so that way you can push those tiny little pieces in, and then if you're impatient like me, so that way you can hold them down as you pull up the word. You certainly could make this easier on yourself by letting it dry before you try to pull up the word, because then your pieces will adhere better to that adhesive underneath. So set that aside, give it a little bit of dry time. Once it's dry, you're going to go ahead and flip it over, and you're going to trim off any excess acetate just along the sides there. I'm going to cut this out using a frame in order to create a nice edge all the way around the card. This frame is really cute. It has like these little sprinkles kind of along the edging of the scallops. I think it's really fun and adorable, so I like these frames a lot. Once I get that where I want it, nice and straight on the card, I'll go ahead and run it through my die cut machine. Now certainly you could do that first before you cut out the word die. That actually might make it a little bit easier for you, because then you don't have to trim any excess acetate off the edges. But it's totally a personal preference type of thing. I like to try and get my word on there and know it's where I like it before I go ahead and put a frame on. So now I'm coming around my word, and you just want to use some foam tape that's about 1/8 of an inch wide. You don't want to use anything wider than that for this style of card because otherwise it's going to be really hard to maneuver around your word. Now you could just create a full shaker pocket behind this. I don't really recommend that though because you're not going to get the full effect of the shaker bit sort of sitting underneath each letter. So you can see how I've sort of created a well underneath each letter with that foam tape. So when this card is standing up, some of the shaker bits are going to kind of settle and rest underneath each letter. And my goal was I didn't want just all my shaker pieces sitting down somewhere in the bottom of the card where you could only see them if you shook the card. So once I've got my release paper taken off, I dotted everything with some liquid glue and I put my shaker mix in there. Here's that trick I was talking about. You're going to just take a Q-tip or a little piece of paper towel, a tissue, whatever you have, something that is going to be soft. You don't want to use anything rough to scratch your acetate, but you're just going to put a little bit of alcohol on it and run it along the acetate. In particular, that works really well with a Q-tip. You also, if you have any little alcohol wipes, you can kind of get those bunched up so they have a tiny space and use those as well. It takes pretty much anything off of the acetate. It works really well. So now I've got some alcohol-friendly ink that I used to stamp out 2 of the doggies from the Doggie Dig It set. I'm going to show you how I colored one of the dogs. The other dog I colored the exact same way. I'm using my warm grays here. I've got a W1, a W2, a W5, and a W7. So I've covered the entire image with my W1. I generally like to get my lightest color all over the entire image so I can get my paper saturated a little bit and make the blending easier. And then I've gone around the edges a little bit here and there with the W5, and then my W2 is what I'm using as a mid-tone, so I use that to blend the W5 into the W1, and then I took the W1 back over the whole inner part of the image. The W7 I'm going to be using on the nose as well as on the paws and things like that. Now, I kind of go back and forth a few times, so sometimes I will do what I just said where I go from light to dark to medium to light. But then if I think things need a little bit more shading, I will go back in with the dark and the medium. It just depends on how I think the image is looking. So I decided to go ahead and use some BGs on the collar, and I will list down below in the description as well all of the colors that I used. Once I'm done with my Copic marker coloring, I always like to come back in and restamp my images. So I always leave my stamps on my MISTI, and then I put my piece of cardstock right back in where it was before. You just really want to make sure it's down in that bottom right hand corner or wherever you had it before. So that way you didn't spend all that time coloring in vain, because that's happened to me before. But it looks really nice when you restamp. I think it just adds a lot of pop to the images because it darkens up that black outline line again. The Copic markers or any alcohol ink markers tend to kind of dull the black ink a little bit in my experience. All right, so I've got my little doggies. I've got them all cut out, and I have put some foam adhesive squares on there and then just dotted them with glue so I can wiggle them around as needed. I am gonna pull up that one there where he's rolling around on his back, which is so cute, and sort of see where I'm gonna place that one before I put the top right hand image up there. There are my 2 little doggies on the card, and I think they look so cute with that love word. I think the love paw word and shadow die is really versatile because you also can use that word and make it into a square. So you could have the L and the paw, and then underneath that have the V and the E, which is kind of cool. So I kept the cut out piece from that stenciled top, and I have just cut out the little paw. I decided I wanted to put this on the inside of the card. I do this quite frequently where I take something from the outside of the card and I add it to the inside just to continue the theme. So when you open the card, it kind of matches the outside. You could use a piece of paper and just run a paper strip along the top or the side of your card. pretty much, it doesn't need to be like a big fancy thing. I think it just adds a nice little touch on the inside when you see some of the same elements inside that were outside. So I'm coming in here with some pigment ink to stamp my sentiment because I want to make sure I get a nice dark impression on my first go. I like to use pigment ink for stamping sentiments, but I also do have my card taped open so it has some dry time because it does take longer for that pigment ink to dry. So there is my finished card, guys. I hope you enjoyed it and you found this video useful. I hope you'll join me over on the Whimsy Stamps Facebook inspiration group. You also can follow Whimsy Stamps on Facebook, Pinterest, and Instagram. Until next time, happy crafting.